The Ink of Sanity Part 3, The Last Period Chapter 10. The architecture of a lie. The cabin was no longer a sanctuary made of cedar and glass. It had transformed into a living, breathing throat of iron and damp wood, swallowing the storm whole. The roar of the lake outside was no longer a natural sound of wind and water. It was a deafening, rhythmic thrum, the heartbeat of a forgotten god made of silt and ancient sorrow. Every floorboard beneath Clara's feet vibrated with a frequency that threatened to shatter her bones. Inside, the air had become a stagnant, suffocating fog, thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy, metallic tang of blood. Clara sat frozen at her desk, her finger trembling just millimeters above the period key. That tiny piece of round metal was now the heaviest object in the universe, a terminal point for a life built on deception. Sheriff Miller was on the floor, his body contorting in a grotesque, agonizing mimicry of a fish hauled onto a dry, salt-cracked shore. Black ink, thick, oily, and pulsating with a life of its own, was leaking from his eyes, his nostrils, and his ears. It wasn't just fluid. It was a physical manifestation of every secret he had ever kept, every lie he had ever told to protect the woman sitting at the desk. "Do it," Sophie whispered into Clara's ear. Her voice was no longer a human rasp. It was a symphony of every wave that had ever broken against a cold, lonely shore. "He took my breath. He took my heartbeat. He took the decades I should have spent in the light. Why do you hesitate to take the life of a man who watched me drown?" Clara looked at her sister. In the flickering, dying light of the halogen lamp, Sophie looked both radiant and monstrous. She was a debt that had been overdue for 20 years. But then, Clara's eyes drifted to the window. The reflection was wrong. In the glass, Sophie wasn't standing behind her. In the glass, there was only Clara, sitting alone in a dark room, her hands covered in red ink, typing into a machine that existed only in her fractured mind. "You're not real," Clara choked out, the words feeling like shards of glass in her throat. "I didn't write you back from the grave. I wrote a monster to hide the face of my own guilt. I built you out of ink because I couldn't bear to look at the bone." Chapter 11. The Bridge of Broken Glass. "Does it matter if I am flesh or fiction?" Sophie countered, her edges blurring and vibrating like a smudge on a wet page. "The truth is carved into the paper now, Clara. The story says the sheriff pushed me. The story says he is a killer. Finish the sentence. Close the book on his life and save your own." Clara's mind, fractured by years of repression, suddenly raced back to the bridge. She felt the stinging, freezing rain on her face. She felt the iron railing beneath her palms. She looked at Miller, who was reaching out a trembling, ink-stained hand toward her, his fingers scratching uselessly at the floorboards. I didn't push her," Miller wheezed, the black ink bubbling at his lips like dark, acidic foam. "You let go, Clara. Look at your hands in the memory. Look at them. You weren't pushed by me or the wind. You let go because you were tired. Tired of the weight. Tired of being her keeper. Tired of her always being the shadow you had to carry." The world seemed to shatter like a mirror hit by a sledgehammer. A new memory, sharp and cold as a surgical blade, sliced through the layers of the fictional narrative Clara had spent 20 years perfecting. She saw the bridge again, but this time, the fog of her lies was gone. She saw her own hand, small and red from the biting cold, gripping Sophie's. She saw the sheer, unadulterated terror in Sophie's eyes. And then, she saw the moment her own fingers had gone limp. It wasn't a sudden movement. It was a slow, deliberate surrender of the will. She had chosen her own freedom over the weight of her sister's life. Miller had arrived a second too late. He had seen Clara's face in the moonlight, the look of relief that preceded the scream. And because he had loved their family, because he couldn't bear to see another life destroyed by the truth, he had spent 20 years protecting her from herself. He hadn't taken the pen as a trophy of a crime. He had taken it to remove the only physical link between Clara's hand and the edge of that bridge. He had become a villain in her story so she could remain a victim in her life. Chapter 12. The Ink's mutiny. The typewriter began to scream a high-pitched, metallic wail of protesting iron. The metal strikers didn't just hit the paper anymore. They began to fly off the machine like shrapnel, slicing through the air. The Hermes 3000 was rejecting the lie. The writer is a liar. The machine typed on its own, the carriage flying back and forth with such violence that the desk began to smoke. The writer is the cage. Every word she has ever sold is a shroud for the child she dropped into the dark. Sophie's form began to dissolve, turning into a swirling cloud of black smoke that filled the cabin. The ink on the floor rose in serpentine coils, wrapping around Clara's ankles and pulling her toward the paper. "No!" Clara shrieked, grabbing the silver pen and plunging it into the wood of the desk. "I can fix it. I can write a world where I never let go. I can rewrite the last 20 years. She pressed the nib of the pen into the center of her palm, the sharp point sinking deep, drawing a thick stream of blood to fuel the dying machine. She began to type with a manic, suicidal energy, her blood splashing across the keys. The water receded. She hammered the keys. The lake gave back what it took. Sophie walked onto the shore, warm and breathing. The guilt was erased from history. The past was a draft that could be deleted, but the paper remained a mocking, blinding white. The ink didn't take. The blood just smeared across the page in useless streaks. The machine didn't want a new story. It didn't want her blood. It wanted her confession. It wanted the only word she had been refusing to say for 2 decades. Chapter 13. The final correction. The water from the lake finally burst through the cabin door, a cold, dark torrent that swept away the furniture and the lies. Miller was swept into the corner, his eyes closing as the black ink finally claimed his heart. Clara stood on top of the desk, the freezing water swirling at her waist. "You can't write a lie anymore, Clara," Sophie said, her voice now coming from inside Clara's own chest. "The ink only works when it's fed by the truth. You want to save the sheriff? Then you have to write the only ending that is honest. You have to take my place." Clara reached down, her fingers finding the cold metal keys one last time. She didn't look at the blood. She looked into the window, where Sophie's reflection was finally beginning to fade, turning into an ordinary shadow. Clara Vance finally stopped running. She typed, each strike sounding like a hammer on a coffin nail. She realized that the sister she mourned was a phantom of her own cowardice. The sheriff was a man who had sacrificed his honor to protect a girl who had no soul left to save. The only way to save the living was for the liar to drown in her own ink. The story ends here. The truth begins. She paused. Her finger hovered over the period. "I'm sorry, Sophie," Clara whispered. "I'm sorry I let go." She slammed her finger onto the key. Click. Chapter 14. The silence of the paper. The roar of the lake vanished instantly, replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like deafness. The water, the mist, the ghost, all of it disappeared in the space between 2 heartbeats. Clara opened her eyes. She wasn't in the cabin. She was sitting in her high-rise apartment in Seattle. The hum of the city was audible through the glass. The sun was shining, casting long, peaceful bars of light across her mahogany desk. She was sitting at her laptop, staring at a completed manuscript titled The Ink of Sanity. Beside the computer sat the silver fountain pen, tarnished and cold. A soft, hesitant knock came at her door. Clara stood up, her entire body feeling like lead. She walked to the door and opened it. Standing there was an old man in a flannel shirt. Miller. His face was weary, but his eyes were clear of the black ink. "It's done, isn't it, Clara?" he asked. Clara looked back at the screen, at the words that finally admitted her guilt to the world. "Yes, I wrote the truth. All of it. I'm going to the station today. Miller nodded slowly, a single tear tracing a path through the wrinkles on his cheek. He reached out and took the silver pen from her hand. Then the debt is paid. You don't have to be the writer anymore, Clara. You can just be a person. He walked away, his footsteps fading into the sounds of the city. As he moved away, Clara noticed his white cuff. It was brilliant, clean, and free of stains.